The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the dusty telegraph office in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, and Roswell Ingram watched a woman step down who would change everything he thought he knew about loneliness. She wore a dark traveling dress that had seen better days, her black hair pinned beneath a simple bonnet, and when she looked around the sun-baked street with eyes the color of strong coffee, he saw something he recognized all too well: pure, unfiltered fear. Roswell had been leaning against the hitching post for the better part of an hour, his worn hat pulled low against the late afternoon sun of September 1885. He had not expected to be here at all. The mail-order bride was supposed to arrive for Jacob Henderson, a sheep rancher who lived 15 miles north of town. But Jacob had gotten himself kicked by one of his own rams 2 days prior and was laid up with a broken leg and 3 cracked ribs. Being Jacob's closest friend and the only man Jacob trusted with something this important, Roswell had agreed to meet the woman and escort her to Jacob's ranch. Except the moment Roswell laid eyes on her, something shifted in his chest like a horse changing direction mid-gallop. She stood beside her single battered trunk, looking at the town with an expression that mingled hope and terror in equal measure. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Pete who Roswell had known for years, climbed down and approached Roswell with an apologetic shrug. "That's her," Pete said, keeping his voice low. "Tried talking to her the whole way from Santa Fe. She doesn't speak a lick of English, not one word. Got her papers here, though." He pulled a folded envelope from his coat pocket. "Says her name is Paloma Jimenez, from Poland, if you can believe it. 22 years old. That's about all I could make out from the documents." Roswell took the envelope, his rough fingers careful with the thin paper. He was 26, had been working cattle since he was 14, and had never expected to feel this particular jolt of recognition when looking at a woman. Especially not a woman meant for another man. "Jacob knows she doesn't speak English?" Roswell asked. "I expect the marriage broker might have forgotten to mention that particular detail," Pete said with a grimace. "Happens more than it should. These fellas are more interested in collecting their fees than making sure things work out." Roswell walked toward the woman slowly, not wanting to startle her. She turned as he approached, and up close he could see the delicate structure of her face, the way exhaustion had carved shadows beneath her eyes, the defensive set of her shoulders. She was small, barely reaching his shoulder, but there was strength in the way she stood her ground. "Madam," he said, removing his hat and offering what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "I'm Roswell Ingram. I'm here to take you to Jacob Henderson's ranch." She stared at him blankly, her dark eyes searching his face for meaning. Then she said something in a language that flowed like water over stones, musical and completely incomprehensible. He caught one word that sounded like Henderson, but the rest was a mystery. Roswell looked back at Pete, who just shrugged again. "Good luck, Rose. You're going to need it." The next hour was an exercise in frustration and improvisation. Roswell managed to communicate through gestures that he would take her trunk, load it onto his wagon, and that she should come with him. She seemed to understand the basic situation, though her hands trembled slightly as she climbed onto the wagon seat beside him. As they rolled out of town, heading north on the dusty road toward Jacob's ranch, Roswell found himself acutely aware of her presence beside him. The September heat was starting to fade as evening approached, and the desert landscape stretched out around them in shades of gold and rust. Roswell tried several times to make conversation, pointing out landmarks, but each attempt was met with that same uncomprehending look. Finally, she spoke again, a longer string of sentences that rose and fell with what sounded like questions. When he could only shake his head helplessly, her shoulders slumped in defeat. They rode in silence for a while, and Roswell used the time to think through the mess he was in. He was supposed to deliver this woman to Jacob, who would marry her and presumably build a life with her despite the language barrier. But something about that plan now felt deeply wrong. Jacob was a good man, fair and honest, but he was also practical to a fault. He had ordered a bride the way he might order new livestock, looking for someone to cook his meals and mend his clothes and eventually bear his children. There was no romance in it, no tenderness, and this woman, Paloma, deserved tenderness. Even in these few short minutes, Roswell could see it. She had traveled thousands of miles on faith and hope alone, leaving everything she knew behind for the promise of a better life. She deserved someone who would learn to speak her language, not just expect her to adapt to his. By the time they reached Jacob's ranch, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and purple across the western sky. Jacob's small ranch house sat in a valley between low hills, with a barn and several outbuildings scattered around it. The place had a tidy, well-maintained look that spoke to Jacob's careful nature. Jacob himself was sitting on the porch, his leg propped up on a wooden crate, when the wagon rolled up. He waved, then tried to stand, thought better of it, and settled back down with a grimace of pain. "That her?" he called out as Roswell brought the wagon to a stop. "That's her," Roswell confirmed, hopping down and moving around to help Paloma descend. She accepted his hand with a murmured word he did not understand, then stood looking at Jacob with renewed apprehension. Jacob studied her for a long moment, his weathered face revealing nothing. He was 34, 8 years older than Roswell, with gray already threading through his brown hair. He was not an unkind man, but he was tired, worn down by years of trying to make a living from stubborn land and stubborn animals. "She's prettier than I expected," Jacob said finally. Then, louder, speaking slowly as if volume might somehow aid comprehension, "Hello there. I'm Jacob Henderson. You're going to be my wife." Paloma looked from Jacob to Roswell, confusion clear on her face. She said something that might have been a greeting, then gestured to Jacob's elevated leg and added what was obviously a question. "Yeah, busted my leg," Jacob said, patting the splinted limb. "That's why I sent Rose here to fetch you." He looked at Roswell then, his eyes narrowing slightly. "She doesn't speak English, not a word," Roswell confirmed. "Pete said her papers show she's from Poland." "Poland?" Jacob rubbed his jaw, considering this. "Well, that's going to make things complicated. How am I supposed to marry a woman I can't even talk to?" It was the opening Roswell needed, though he felt guilty for the relief that flooded through him. "Maybe you should wait until you can communicate," he suggested, keeping his tone neutral. "Give it some time. Let her settle in. You can't exactly do much courting with that leg anyway." Jacob snorted. "I wasn't planning on courting. I was planning on marrying and getting on with things." But he was already looking doubtful. "Though I suppose you have a point. Reverend Martin wouldn't marry us if she can't understand the vows. That wouldn't be proper." "It wouldn't," Roswell agreed quickly. "And with you laid up, you cannot really take care of a new wife anyway. Maybe I should take her back to my place for a few weeks, just until you are back on your feet and can figure out how to talk to her." The suggestion hung in the air between them. Roswell's ranch was smaller than Jacob's, just a modest spread 5 miles south, but it was comfortable enough. He had a spare room that had belonged to his mother before she passed 3 years ago. It would be proper, or as proper as anything could be under these strange circumstances. Jacob considered this, his practical nature warring with his discomfort at the situation. Finally, he nodded. "Might be for the best. I cannot even cook for myself right now, let alone take care of a wife who doesn't know the language. But Rose, you make sure people know she's my intended. I do not want any talk." "There will not be any talk," Roswell promised, though his heart was hammering in his chest in a way that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with the woman standing silently beside him. Explaining the change in plans to Paloma was another exercise in creative gesturing. She seemed alarmed at first when Roswell indicated she would be going with him instead of staying with Jacob, but something in his face must have reassured her because she eventually nodded. They loaded her trunk back onto the wagon. Jacob gave Roswell a few more instructions about propriety and respecting his claim, and then they were back on the road as full dark descended. The stars came out in their thousands, spread across the New Mexico sky like diamonds on black velvet. Paloma looked up at them and said something soft, almost to herself. Roswell wished desperately that he knew what she was saying. He wanted to know what she was thinking, feeling, fearing. He wanted to tell her that she was safe, that he would protect her, that everything would work out somehow. Instead, he just drove the wagon through the darkness, the lantern swinging from its hook casting a small pool of light around them. When they reached his ranch, Roswell lit the lamps in the house and showed Paloma to the spare room. It was simple but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small dresser. His mother's old quilt still covered the bed, a pattern of blue and white stars that had taken her 2 years to complete. Paloma set her small cloth bag on the bed and turned to him, her eyes meeting his directly. "Thank you," she said clearly, and he realized with a start that those were English words carefully memorized. "You are welcome," he replied slowly, pointing to himself. "Roswell," she repeated it, her accent turning the sounds into something musical. "Roswell." Then she pointed to herself. "Paloma." They stood there in the lamplight, two strangers separated by language but connected by something neither of them could name yet. Roswell knew he should leave, should let her rest after her long journey, but he found himself reluctant to break this fragile moment of connection. Finally, he pantomimed eating and drinking, raising his eyebrows in question. She nodded eagerly, and he realized she was probably hungry. He led her to the kitchen and began pulling out bread, cheese, dried meat, and apples. She watched him move around the kitchen, then hesitantly began to help, slicing the bread with competent efficiency. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Comfortable, almost companionable. When they finished, Paloma insisted on washing the dishes despite his protests. He stood beside her, drying each plate and cup she handed him, and found himself smiling at the domesticity of it all. That night, lying in his own bed with Paloma safely in the room down the hall, Roswell stared at the ceiling and tried to reconcile what he knew he should do with what he wanted to do. She was Jacob's intended bride. Jacob was his friend. The honorable thing would be to keep his distance, to treat her with respect but nothing more, to deliver her back to Jacob as soon as possible. But honor had never felt quite so much like a prison before. The next morning, Roswell woke before dawn as always and went about his usual chores. He was feeding the horses when Paloma emerged from the house, already dressed, her hair braided neatly down her back. She looked around the ranch with interest, taking in the corrals, the small barn, the chicken coop, the well. He gestured for her to follow him and showed her around, naming things as he pointed. Horse, chicken, cow. She repeated each word carefully, her accent thick but her attention focused. He realized she was intelligent, that she wanted to learn, and an idea began to form in his mind. After breakfast, he went to the shelf where he kept his few books and pulled down an old primer that had belonged to him as a child. It had pictures alongside words, simple illustrations of common objects. He brought it to the table where Paloma was mending a tear in his work shirt without him even asking her to, and opened the book between them. She looked at the book, then at him, and her face lit up with understanding. For the next hour they sat together while he pointed to pictures and said the English words. She repeated them, sometimes getting them right, sometimes mangling the pronunciation so badly they both ended up laughing. But she never got frustrated, never gave up. She just kept trying. Over the following days, a routine developed. Roswell would do his morning chores while Paloma prepared breakfast. They would eat together, then spend time with the primer and other books, with Paloma learning English words and phrases. In the afternoons, while Roswell worked the ranch, Paloma took care of the house, tending the garden, feeding the chickens, cooking meals that were far better than anything Roswell had managed on his own. But more than the routine, something else was developing between them. Small moments of connection that went beyond words. The way she would bring him water when he was working in the hot sun. The concern in her eyes when he came in with a cut on his hand from fixing a fence. The way he would find wildflowers on the kitchen table that he knew she had picked early in the morning. The way they had begun to communicate in gestures and expressions, developing their own language of looks and touches and smiles. A week after Paloma arrived, Roswell was in town buying supplies when he ran into Reverend Martin outside the general store. The Reverend was a kindly man in his 50s who had presided over Truth or Consequences small church for nearly 20 years. "Roswell," the Reverend greeted him warmly. "I heard you are hosting Jacob Henderson's mail-order bride until his leg heals." News traveled fast in a small town. Roswell nodded. "That's right, Reverend. Seemed like the practical thing to do." "Very charitable of you," Reverend Martin said. "I also heard the young lady does not speak English." "She is learning," Roswell said, and could not help the pride that crept into his voice. "She is smart, picks things up quick." The Reverend studied him with eyes that were sharper than they looked. "Be careful, son. I know you to be a good man, but the heart has a way of ignoring what the mind knows is right." Roswell felt heat creep up his neck. "I am just helping her learn the language, Reverend." "I am sure you are," Reverend Martin said gently. "Just remember that she is spoken for. Jacob Henderson is my friend, and so are you. I would hate to see this situation cause pain to any of you." The Reverend's words stayed with Roswell as he drove the wagon back to his ranch. He knew the man was right. He was growing attached to Paloma in ways that went far beyond simple hospitality. He looked forward to their morning lessons, to the sound of her laughter when he taught her a particularly difficult English word. He had started noticing small things about her. The way she tucked a stray hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, the fierce competence with which she approached every task, the sadness that sometimes shadowed her eyes when she thought he was not looking. He needed to know more about her, needed to understand who she had been before she arrived in New Mexico. That evening, after dinner, he pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil. Using the simple words she had learned and a lot of pantomiming, he managed to ask her about Poland, about her family, about why she had come to America. Paloma's face grew somber. She took the pencil from him and drew a simple picture, a house, stick figures of people. Then she drew lines through some of the figures. "Mama, Papa, brother," she said in halting English, pointing to the crossed-out figures. "Sick, dead." Her parents and brother had died, probably from disease. Roswell felt his throat tighten with sympathy. She drew another figure alone. "Me." Then she pointed to the distance, to the west. America. New life. She had been alone, desperate for a new beginning. She had risked everything on the hope that marriage to a stranger would be better than whatever she had left behind. Roswell reached out and covered her hand with his, wanting to offer comfort. She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw not just sadness but strength, resilience, hope. "You are safe here," he said, knowing she would not understand all the words but hoping she would feel the truth of them. You are not alone. She turned her hand under his, their palms pressing together, and said something in Polish that sounded like a promise or a prayer. They sat like that for a long moment, hands joined across the table, the lamp burning low between them. That night marked a change. They were more careful with each other now, hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every lingering look. Roswell found himself lying awake, knowing she was just down the hall and wondering what would happen when Jacob's leg healed and it was time to take Paloma back to him. 2 weeks after Paloma's arrival, Jacob sent word through a ranch hand that his leg was healing well and that he wanted to come by Roswell's place to check on his bride. Roswell felt something cold settle in his stomach when he got the message. He had known this moment would come, but he was not ready for it. When he told Paloma that Jacob would be visiting the next day, using the English words she now understood along with gestures, her face went carefully blank. "Jacob," she repeated. "The man, my husband." "Your intended husband," Roswell corrected, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "The man you came to marry." She nodded slowly, her dark eyes searching his face. "You take me to Jacob, eventually," Roswell said, "when his leg is better, when you are ready." "I am ready now," she asked, and there was something in her tone he could not quite read. "Are you?" he countered. She looked down at her hands folded in her lap. "I do not know," she admitted in careful English. Then she looked back up at him. "What you want, Roswell?" It was a loaded question, and they both knew it. What did he want? He wanted her to stay here in his house, learning English at his kitchen table and filling his days with her presence. He wanted to learn her language too, to meet her halfway. He wanted to hear her story in her own words, not filtered through broken English and pantomime. He wanted to court her properly, to give her a choice instead of watching her be handed over to a man she did not know and could not talk to. But what he wanted did not matter. She was promised to Jacob, and Jacob was a good man who deserved a wife. "It does not matter what I want," Roswell said finally. "You are here for Jacob." Paloma's expression shifted to something that looked like disappointment, but before either of them could say more, the moment passed. Jacob arrived the next afternoon, riding in a wagon driven by his ranch hand, his leg still splinted but clearly on the mend. Paloma came out of the house when she heard the wagon, drying her hands on her apron. Roswell stood beside her, close enough that he could feel the tension radiating from her body. Jacob climbed down from the wagon with care, accepting a crutch from his ranch hand. He looked at Paloma with an appraising expression, then nodded as if confirming something to himself. "She looks well," he said to Roswell, as if Paloma was not standing right there. "You have been taking good care of her." "She takes care of herself," Roswell said, his tone sharper than he intended. "She has been learning English too. Show him Paloma." Paloma looked uncertain, but she drew herself up and spoke to Jacob in careful, measured English. "Hello, Jacob Henderson. I am Paloma Jimenez. I am happy to meet you." Jacob's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Well now, that is impressive. Rose, you have been teaching her." "We have been working on it together," Roswell said. Jacob studied Paloma more carefully now, really looking at her for the first time. Then he glanced at Roswell, and something flickered across his face, understanding, perhaps, or concern. "Could I speak with you privately, Rose?" They walked away from the house, leaving Paloma standing on the porch. When they were out of earshot, Jacob turned to face Roswell squarely. "You have feelings for her," Jacob said bluntly. It was not a question. Roswell considered lying, but Jacob had known him too long. "I do," he admitted. "But that does not change anything. She came here to marry you." "Did she?" Jacob asked. "Or did she come here to marry anyone who would give her a new life? Rose, I am not a fool. I can see the way she looks at you, and the way you look at her." He paused, leaning on his crutch. "Truth is, I have been thinking while laid up. I ordered a bride because I was tired of being alone, tired of doing everything myself. But that is not a reason to marry someone. She deserves better than that, and you." He smiled slightly. "You have been alone since your ma passed. Maybe it is time you had someone to share that ranch with." Roswell stared at his friend, not quite believing what he was hearing. "Are you saying—" "I am saying I release her from our agreement," Jacob said firmly. "If she wants you and you want her, then that is what should happen. I will write a letter explaining the situation to the marriage broker. Return the money I paid for the arrangement. It is the right thing to do." Relief and joy flooded through Roswell so powerfully he nearly staggered, but he forced himself to think clearly. "This is not just about what I want or what you want. It is about what she wants. We need to ask her, let her choose." "Fair enough," Jacob agreed. "But Rose, I think we both know what her choice will be." They walked back to the house together. Paloma had gone inside, but she emerged when they approached. Roswell could see the anxiety in the set of her shoulders, the way her hands twisted in her apron. Jacob spoke first, and Roswell translated as best he could, using the simple English words Paloma had learned. "Jacob says you do not have to marry him if you do not want to. He says you can choose. You can go with him to his ranch and be his wife, or you can stay here with me." Paloma looked from Jacob to Roswell, her eyes wide. "I can choose. You can choose," Roswell confirmed, his heart hammering. She was silent for a long moment, and in that silence Roswell felt his entire future hanging in the balance. Then Paloma turned to Jacob and spoke in halting English. "You are good man. Thank you for giving me chance for new life. But my heart—" She put her hand over her chest, then pointed to Roswell. "My heart is here." Jacob smiled, a genuine expression of goodwill. "Then that settles it." He extended his hand to Roswell. "Take care of her, my friend, and take care of yourself." After Jacob left, Roswell and Paloma stood in the yard, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the dusty ground. They looked at each other, really looked, without the weight of obligation between them anymore. "I want to learn your language," Roswell said suddenly. "Polish. I want you to teach me the way I have been teaching you English. I want to meet you halfway." Paloma's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "You want to learn Polish?" "For me, for us," Roswell corrected. She said something in rapid Polish, her voice thick with emotion. Then she repeated it in English. "I thought I would have to lose everything, my language, my past, myself, to be American, but you want to know who I was, who I am." "I want to know everything," Roswell said. "I want to know the words you spoke as a child, the songs your mother sang, the stories that made you who you are. I want all of you, Paloma, not just the parts that fit easily into my world." She closed the distance between them and took both his hands in hers. "Then I will teach you. Every day we teach each other. You learn my language, I learn yours. We build something new together." That evening they sat at the kitchen table and Paloma began teaching him Polish. The sounds were strange in his mouth, the grammar confusing and complex. He stumbled over words that came easily to her, and she laughed at his pronunciation. But she was patient, correcting him gently, encouraging him when he got frustrated. "Tree," Roswell said in English, pointing to the picture in one of his books. "Drzuo," Paloma said in Polish, and he repeated it, mangling the sounds. She laughed and said it again, slower, and he tried again. On the third attempt he got closer, and her face lit up with delight. They spent hours like that, going through objects and actions, building a shared vocabulary. Roswell learned that her word for love was milosk, a word that felt heavy and important on his tongue. He learned that she called the New Mexico sky Nebo, the same word she used for heaven. He learned that when she said Dom, she meant home, and that when she looked at him while saying it, she was not talking about a building. Over the following weeks, their dual language lessons became the center of their days. In the mornings, they spoke primarily in English, with Paloma continuing to expand her vocabulary and grammar. In the evenings, they switched to Polish, with Roswell slowly, painfully, learning to form the unfamiliar sounds and sentence structures. But the learning was not confined to language. Roswell learned about Paloma's childhood in a small village outside Krakow, about the father who had been a carpenter and the mother who had kept bees. He learned that her brother had been younger, only 16 when he died of the fever that had swept through their village and taken half its population. He learned that she had spent 2 years alone after their deaths, working as a seamstress, before finally deciding that America offered the only hope for a different life. Paloma learned about Roswell's life too. About growing up on this ranch with parents who had loved each other deeply and taught him what real partnership looked like. About losing his father to a riding accident when Roswell was 19. About caring for his mother through her illness until she passed peacefully 3 years later. About the loneliness of the years since, working the ranch alone, going through the motions of life without really living it. They learned each other's stories, and in learning them, they fell deeper in love. One evening in October, with the air turning crisp and the first hints of winter on the wind, Roswell was practicing Polish phrases while Paloma prepared dinner. He had been working on this particular sentence for days, checking the pronunciation in the Polish-English dictionary he had ordered from Santa Fe, practicing when she was not around. As she stirred the pot on the stove, Roswell came up behind her and said, "Kacham sai, Paloma." She went very still. Then she turned to face him, the wooden spoon still in her hand, her eyes wide and bright. "You said it right," she whispered. "You said I love you in Polish, perfect pronunciation." "I have been practicing," he admitted. "I wanted to say it to you in your language first. To show you that I mean it, that I am willing to live in your world as much as you live in mine." He took a breath. "Kachem sai, I love you." Paloma set down the spoon and cupped his face in her hands. "Kachem sai," she said back. Then, in English, "I love you, Roswell Ingram. I love you so much my heart feels too big for my chest." He kissed her then, gently at first, then with all the passion and longing that had been building between them for weeks. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Paloma laughed and pressed her forehead to his. "Dinner will burn," she said. "I do not care," he replied and kissed her again. They married 3 weeks later in November of 1885 in the small church in Truth or Consequences. Reverend Martin performed the ceremony, which was conducted in both English and Polish, with Roswell and Paloma speaking their vows in both languages. Jacob Henderson stood as Roswell's best man, smiling genuinely throughout the ceremony. A few of the town's women had befriended Paloma by then, and they stood with her, offering their support and welcome. When Reverend Martin pronounced them husband and wife, he said it first in English, then in Polish, having learned the phrase specifically for the occasion. Jestesi mezum I zona. The small reception afterward was held at the church hall, with food contributed by various townspeople. Paloma had made a traditional Polish cake called makałek, filled with poppy seeds and honey, and the townsfolk were charmed by both the dessert and by her efforts to thank each of them in English. That night, as newlyweds, Roswell and Paloma returned to the ranch that was now officially theirs together. Roswell carried her over the threshold, a tradition she had learned about and found amusing. He set her down gently in the main room, and they stood there for a moment, looking at each other in the lamplight. "Are you happy?" he asked in Polish. "Yes," she answered in English. Then she smiled. "Ask me in English." "Are you happy?" he repeated. "Tak," she said, the Polish word for yes. very happy. They made love that night with a tenderness that came from truly knowing each other, from having put in the work to communicate across every barrier between them. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Paloma curled against his side, Roswell felt a peace he had not known was possible. "Tell me something in Polish," he murmured. "Something beautiful." Paloma was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she began to speak, her voice soft and rhythmic. It was a poem, he realized, or maybe a song. He did not understand all the words, but he caught some of them. Love, home, stars, forever. When she finished, he kissed her temple. "What did it mean?" he asked. "It is an old folk song," she explained. "About finding home in another person, about how love can make any place feel like where you were meant to be." "Teach me the words," Roswell said. "I want to be able to sing it with you." So there in the dark, she taught him the song line by line, correcting his pronunciation, laughing softly when he got the melody wrong. By the time they finally fell asleep, he had learned the first verse, and Paloma promised they would work on the rest in the days to come. The first year of their marriage was one of adjustment and joy in equal measure. They continued their language lessons, both becoming more fluent in each other's tongues. Roswell would never speak Polish like a native. His accent always gave him away, but he became conversational, able to hold real discussions with Paloma about complex topics. Similarly, Paloma's English improved to the point where she could chat easily with the women in town, even making jokes that showed she understood the subtleties of the language. They worked the ranch together, with Paloma proving to be an able partner. She had grown up in a farming village and understood the rhythm of working the land. She took over the chickens and the garden completely, expanding both. She learned to ride, though she never loved it the way Roswell did, and she could handle a rifle well enough to protect the livestock from coyotes when necessary. In December, the first real winter storm hit, blanketing the ranch in snow. They spent 3 days essentially snowed in, and Roswell half expected to go stir-crazy confined to the house. Instead, those days became some of his favorite memories. They stayed in bed late, made love in the afternoon, told each other stories by the fire. Paloma taught him Polish card games and he taught her the guitar, or at least tried to, though she laughingly declared she had no musical talent. "You sing beautifully, though," he insisted. "I have heard you singing in the garden." "That is different," she said, but she was blushing, pleased. By spring, Paloma had become a real part of the community in Truth or Consequences. The initial wariness some townspeople had felt toward a foreigner had faded as they got to know her. She had a way with people, a warmth that transcended language barriers. She helped nurse Sarah Whitmore's children through the measles, taught Margaret Coleman how to make her poppy seed cake, and even managed to befriend the notoriously prickly Mrs. Henderson, Jacob's aunt who ran the boarding house. Roswell watched his wife integrate into their community with a mixture of pride and wonder. She had come here alone and afraid, unable to speak the language, and had transformed herself into someone confident and capable. But more than that, she had maintained her sense of self through the process. She spoke Polish at home whenever she wanted to, cooked both American and Polish dishes, told stories from both cultures. She was not trying to erase who she had been. She was building on it, creating something new. In June of 1886, 9 months after their wedding, Paloma came to Roswell with news that made his heart stop and then race. She was pregnant. They were going to have a baby. Roswell had never been particularly emotional, but he found himself with tears in his eyes as he held his wife close and felt the joy wash over both of them. A baby. A child who would speak both English and Polish, who would belong to both worlds, who would be the living embodiment of the bridge they had built between them. "Are you scared?" he asked her later that evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "A little," Paloma admitted. "But mostly I am happy, excited." She paused. "I wish my mama could be here, to meet her grandchild, to see that I found happiness." "Tell me about her," Roswell said. "Tell me everything you remember. We will make sure our child knows about their grandmother, about where they come from on both sides." So Paloma talked about her mother, about the woman who had taught her to sew and to garden, who had sung lullabies in Polish and told stories about brave heroes and clever girls. Roswell listened and committed it all to memory, determined to keep these stories alive for the next generation. Paloma's pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into the fall. As her belly grew, Roswell found himself becoming almost comically protective. He tried to keep her from lifting anything heavy, from working too hard in the garden, from riding into town. Paloma tolerated this for about a week before sitting him down and firmly explaining, in a mixture of English and Polish that left no room for argument, that she was pregnant, not fragile, and that he needed to trust her to know her own limits. "My mama worked until the day she went into labor with my brother," Paloma said. "I am strong. Our baby is strong. You do not need to treat me like glass." Roswell backed off, though he could not help worrying. The nearest doctor was in Truth or Consequences, and while Dr. Patterson was competent, childbirth was dangerous. Women died. Babies died. It was a fact of life on the frontier, one that everyone knew and no one talked about directly. But he did not voice these fears to Paloma. Instead, he made sure the house was ready, that they had everything they might need. He arranged for Mrs. Henderson, who had assisted with dozens of births, to be available when Paloma's time came. He prayed, though he was not a particularly religious man, because it was the only other thing he knew to do. In January of 1887, on a cold, clear night when the stars seemed close enough to touch, Paloma woke Roswell in the early morning hours. "It is time," she said calmly, though he could see the tension around her eyes. "The baby is coming." Roswell sprang into action, riding hard into town to fetch Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Patterson. By the time they returned, Paloma's contractions were coming regularly, and she was walking around the house, pausing to breathe through each wave of pain. What followed were the longest hours of Roswell's life. Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Patterson took over the bedroom, with Mrs. Henderson shooing Roswell out firmly. "This is women's work," she said. "You go boil water, Pace, do whatever it is men do. We will call you when there is news." But Paloma called for him almost immediately, her voice sharp through the door. "Roswell." Mrs. Henderson opened the door, her expression softening. "She wants you. I suppose there is no harm in it." Roswell went to his wife's side and took her hand. She gripped it hard through the next contraction, her face tight with pain. When it passed, she looked up at him with fierce determination in her eyes. "Stay with me," she said. "I need you here." "I am not going anywhere," he promised. He stayed through all of it, holding her hand, wiping her brow, speaking to her in Polish when the pain got too intense, and English seemed too foreign. He whispered "Kacham Sai" over and over, told her how strong she was, how proud he was of her. Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Patterson exchanged looks, but said nothing about the impropriety of a husband being present for the birth. It was clear that neither Roswell nor Paloma cared about convention. Just before dawn, as the eastern sky was beginning to lighten, their son was born. He came into the world with a lusty cry that announced his presence to anyone within earshot. Dr. Patterson caught him, checked him quickly, and then placed him on Paloma's chest. "A healthy boy," the doctor announced, smiling. "Congratulations." Paloma looked down at their son with an expression of such pure love that Roswell felt his heart might burst. Then she looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, and smiled. "He is perfect," she whispered. "Look what we made." Roswell looked at his son, red-faced and squalling, covered in the mess of birth, and thought he had never seen anything more beautiful. He kissed Paloma's forehead, then gently touched their baby's tiny hand. The infant's fingers closed around his, gripping with surprising strength. "What should we name him?" Roswell asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had not settled on anything definite. Now Paloma looked at their son thoughtfully. "In Polish, we have a tradition of naming children after family," she said. "My father's name was Peter." "In English, that is Peter." "Peter," Roswell repeated, testing the sound. "I like it, Peter Ingram." "Peter Ingram," Paloma said, using the Polish pronunciation. "He can be both, Peter in English, Peter in Polish." And so their son was named, a boy who would grow up speaking two languages, understanding two cultures, belonging fully to both. The first months of Peter's life were exhausting and wonderful. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, but he still needed constant care. Roswell and Paloma took turns walking him when he was fussy, feeding him, changing him, marveling at every small development. Roswell discovered that fatherhood suited him. He loved holding his son, loved singing to him in both English and Polish, loved watching Paloma nurse him and seeing the bond between mother and child. He found himself thinking about the future in new ways, about the world he wanted Peter to grow up in, about the lessons he wanted to teach him. One of those lessons, he decided, would be about respect. Respect for both sides of his heritage, for people who spoke different languages, for the hard work it took to build bridges between cultures. He wanted Peter to understand that his mother's courage in coming to a strange land and learning a new language was something to be proud of, that being multilingual and multicultural was a strength, not a weakness. As Peter grew from infant to toddler, Roswell and Paloma were deliberate about raising him bilingually. They spoke both English and Polish in the house, sometimes mixing them in the same conversation. They sang him songs in both languages, told him stories from both traditions. When he began to speak, his first words were a mix. Mama, tata, which was Polish for daddy, horse, and mliko, which was Polish for milk. The community in truth or consequences embraced young Peter. He became something of a town mascot, this bright-eyed boy who could switch between languages without thinking about it. When he was 3 years old and they took him to church, he shocked everyone by reciting the Lord's Prayer in Polish, which Paloma had taught him. Reverend Martin laughed in delight and declared it one of the finest things he had ever heard. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Roswell expanded the herd. Paloma's garden became legendary in the area, and they hired a young ranch hand named Tommy to help with the heavier work. Roswell taught Tommy some basic Polish phrases, mostly because Peter thought it was hilarious to hear Tommy mangle the pronunciation. In 1889, when Peter was 2, Paloma became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was harder on her, with more sickness and exhaustion. Roswell worried, but Paloma assured him that every pregnancy was different and that she was fine. True to her word, she carried the baby to term without major complications. Their daughter was born in September of that year, a tiny, delicate thing with dark hair like her mother and blue eyes that would eventually turn brown. They named her Maria, a name that existed in both English and Polish, with the middle name Rose after Roswell's mother. Peter was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything. Roswell would often find him sitting beside the cradle, talking to Maria in a mix of English and Polish, telling her about the horses and the chickens and everything he thought was important in the world. She cannot understand you yet, Roswell told him gently. But she will, Peter said with the confidence of a toddler. And when she does, I will teach her everything. Maria proved to be a quiet baby, watchful and alert. As she grew, it became clear she had inherited her mother's sharp intelligence and her father's steady temperament. She learned to speak even earlier than Peter had, and like her brother, she slipped easily between languages. The years passed, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and family. There were hard times. A drought in 1891 that killed half the herd. A winter storm in 1893 that damaged the barn and had them scrambling to shelter the animals. The year Maria got a fever that had them terrified until it broke. But there were far more good times. Birthdays and holidays, harvest celebrations, Sunday dinners after church, quiet evenings on the porch watching the children play. Roswell and Paloma's love deepened over the years, matured into something both comfortable and passionate. They still had their language lessons, though now they were teaching the children more than learning themselves. They still spoke to each other in Polish when they wanted privacy from prying young ears, though Peter and Maria were getting good enough to understand more than their parents realized. In 1895, when Peter was 8 and Maria was 6, Paloma suggested they make a trip. "I want to go to Krakow," she said one evening after the children were in bed. "I want to see Poland again. I want Peter and Maria to meet my family's country, to see where I came from." Roswell's first instinct was to worry about the cost, the logistics, the time away from the ranch. But then he looked at his wife's face, saw the longing there, and knew it was important. "Then we will go," he said. "Next year, when we have saved enough money, we will all go to Poland." Paloma threw her arms around him, speaking rapid Polish, thanking him over and over. When she finally pulled back, there were tears in her eyes. "I left thinking I would never return," she said, "that I would never see my home again, but you are giving me this gift." "You gave me everything," Roswell said simply. "This is the least I can do." They spent the next year preparing. Roswell hired a more experienced ranch hand to manage things while they were gone. They saved every spare penny. They taught the children about Poland, about the journey they would take, about the importance of understanding their heritage. Peter and Maria were excited, asking countless questions about ships and oceans and foreign countries. In the spring of 1896, the Ingram family boarded a train in Truth or Consequences, beginning the long journey that would take them to New York, then across the Atlantic to Europe, and finally to Poland. It was Peter's and Maria's first time seeing anything beyond New Mexico, and their excitement was infectious. The sea voyage was rough, and Roswell discovered he was prone to seasickness, which Peter found hilarious. "Papa is green," he announced to anyone who would listen, "like a sick frog." But eventually they made landfall in Europe and began the overland journey to Krakow. Paloma grew more animated the closer they got, pointing out landmarks, talking faster in Polish than she had in years. When they finally arrived in the city, she cried, overwhelmed by the rush of memories and emotions. They spent a month in Poland, visiting the village where Paloma had grown up, seeing the house where she had lived though it was occupied by another family now. She took them to the churchyard and showed them the graves of her parents and brother, speaking to them in Polish, telling them about Roswell and the children, about the life she had built in America. Peter and Maria soaked it all in, their Polish improving rapidly through immersion. They met distant cousins of Paloma's, played with Polish children, ate Polish food, and experienced their mother's homeland fully. Roswell, too, found himself falling in love with the country his wife came from, understanding her in new and deeper ways as he saw the landscape that had shaped her. But as much as they enjoyed Poland, They were all ready to go home by the time their month was up. New Mexico called to them with its wide skies and dry heat and familiar rhythms. They were not visitors there. They belonged. The journey back was long but filled with good spirits. On the ship returning to America, Paloma stood at the rail with Roswell, watching their children play with other young passengers. "Thank you," she said, "for taking us there, for understanding how important it was." "Thank you for building a life with me," Roswell replied. "For taking a chance on a cowboy who did not even speak your language." "You learned my language," Paloma said, smiling. "You learned it to tell me you loved me. That was when I knew for certain you were the right man." She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her. "I came to America thinking I would have to give up everything I was to become someone new. But you taught me I could be both, Polish and American, Paloma and Mrs. Ingram, old and new together." "The children are both too," Roswell observed, watching Peter teach Maria some kind of game. "They do not see the two parts as separate. To them, it is just who they are." "That is how it should be," Paloma said. They returned to Truth or Consequences in the summer of 1896, and it felt like coming home in the truest sense. The ranch was waiting for them. The New Mexico sun beat down with familiar intensity, and their neighbors welcomed them back with genuine warmth. Tommy, the ranch hand, had done an excellent job maintaining everything, and had plenty of stories about his adventures as temporary boss. Life continued. The children grew. Peter showed an aptitude for ranching and for languages beyond just English and Polish. He picked up Spanish from their Mexican neighbors and seemed to have an ear for learning. Maria was more interested in books and learning, and Paloma worked hard to teach her to read in both English and Polish. By the time she was 10, Maria was reading literature in both languages and talking about becoming a teacher someday. In 1900, as the new century dawned, the Ingram family gathered on their porch to watch the sunrise on the first day of the new era. Peter was 13 now, nearly as tall as Roswell. Maria was 11, reading a book as always. Paloma was 40, with silver threads in her dark hair and laugh lines around her eyes. Roswell was 44, weathered by years of ranch work but healthy and content. "What do you think this new century will bring?" Peter asked, his voice cracking as it had started to do recently. "Change," Roswell said. "The world is changing fast, but some things stay the same: family, love, hard work. And the importance of understanding each other," Paloma added, "of learning each other's languages, not just words but hearts." She smiled at Roswell. "Your father taught me that." "Papa, tell us again how you learned Polish," Maria said, setting down her book. She had heard the story dozens of times but never tired of it. "I learned it because I loved your mother," Roswell said. "And I wanted her to know that I saw her, all of her, not just the parts that were easy or convenient. I wanted to meet her where she was." "That is the most romantic thing," Maria sighed dramatically, and they all laughed. But it was true, Roswell thought. Everything good in his life had come from that decision to learn Paloma's language, to value her enough to do the hard work of real communication. It had been the foundation of their marriage, of their family, of the life they had built together. More years passed, each one adding to the rich tapestry of their shared life. Peter grew into a strong young man who eventually married a girl from town and started his own ranch nearby. He and his wife had 3 children, and Roswell and Paloma became grandparents, doting on the little ones and teaching them Polish songs just as they had taught their own children. Maria, true to her dreams, became a teacher in Truth or Consequences. She taught English but also offered Polish lessons to anyone interested, keeping her mother's language alive in the community. She never married, claiming she was too busy with her students and her books, but she was happy, and that was what mattered. As they grew older, Roswell and Paloma found themselves with more time to simply be together. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing, mixing English and Polish without thinking about it. Sometimes they talked about the past, reminiscing about their early days together, laughing about how they had communicated when Paloma first arrived. Sometimes they talked about the present, about their children and grandchildren, about the ranch and the town and their friends. Sometimes they talked about the future, about what would come after they were gone, about the legacy they were leaving. "We did good," Paloma said one evening in 1910. She was 60 now, her hair fully silver, her hands showing the work of years. But her eyes were still bright, still full of the spirit that had brought her across an ocean to a strange land. "We did," Roswell agreed. He was 64, his back giving him trouble these days, his hands stiff with arthritis. But he could still ride, still work, still hold his wife close. "Do you ever regret it?" Paloma asked suddenly. "Choosing me over Jacob's arrangement, building a life with someone who could not even speak your language when you met." Roswell looked at her, this woman who had been his partner for 25 years, who had learned his language and taught him hers, who had borne his children and built a home with him, who had made every day richer simply by being in it. "Not for one single second," he said. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me. Learning your language, learning you, was the smartest thing I ever did." Paloma leaned over and kissed him, soft and sweet. "Kacham sai," she whispered. "Kacham sai," he whispered back. They lived many more good years together, watching their grandchildren grow, seeing the world change around them. Cars appeared on the roads, electricity came to truth or consequences. The Wild West of their youth became something people read about in books rather than lived. But through all the changes, their love remained constant. Roswell died peacefully in his sleep in 1918, at the age of 72. Paloma was beside him when it happened, holding his hand as she had held it so many times before. She grieved him deeply, but found comfort in their children and grandchildren, in the life they had built together, in the knowledge that they had loved each other well and fully for over 3 decades. Paloma lived another 8 years, passing away in 1926 at the age of 76. In her final days, surrounded by family, she spoke mostly in Polish, returning to the language of her childhood. But her last words were in English, a message for her husband, though he had already gone ahead. "I am coming, Roswell," she said clearly. "Wait for me." They buried her beside him in the cemetery in Truth or Consequences, under a stone that bore both their names and an inscription in both English and Polish. They spoke different languages, but had the same heart. Their children and grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren, carried on their legacy, maintaining the tradition of bilingualism, of respecting both halves of their heritage. The story of how Roswell learned Polish to say, "I love you" to Paloma became family legend, told and retold at gatherings, an example of what real love looked like. Because in the end, that was the truth of it. Real love was not about grand gestures or dramatic moments, though there had been some of those. Real love was about showing up every day and doing the work, about learning someone else's language because you wanted to understand them fully, about building a life together word by word, day by day, choice by choice. Roswell had been a cowboy in the Wild West who met a mail-order bride who spoke no English. He could have insisted she adapt completely to his world, could have treated the language barrier as her problem to solve. Instead, he had chosen to learn her language, to meet her halfway, to show through action and effort and hours of study that she mattered to him, that all of her mattered, not just the parts that were convenient. And Paloma, brave enough to cross an ocean for a new life, had found not just a husband but a true partner, someone who valued her enough to learn the words of her heart. Together they had built something beautiful and lasting, a family that spanned 2 cultures and 2 languages, held together by love that transcended any barrier. Their ranch still stood decades later, passed down through the generations, a testament to what 2 people could build when they chose to understand each other. In the house, you could still find books in both English and Polish on the shelves. In the family, you could still hear both languages spoken. And in the hearts of all who descended from Roswell and Paloma Ingram, there lived the knowledge that love is not about finding someone who already speaks your language, but about being willing to learn theirs, and in doing so, creating something entirely new together.